Thank you very much, Sabina. I hope you can hear me all right. Thank you very much, Sabina, for the very kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. I am truly honored to be hosted in such a long-standing and terrific seminar. So it is really a wonderful opportunity. And again, I wish to thank Sabina for the invitation. What I am presenting today is, as Sabina mentioned, part of a work in progress, which is drawn from my current research on scientific styles. It's part of a EU project of which I'm sort of halfway through. So probably what I'm presenting today is gonna look half-baked, unfortunately, but it is all the more important for me to receive feedback. So I will be very grateful for all feedback and comments you might want to share. I hope you are able to see the slides, full screen.
Yeah, it's all good.
Yes, all looking perfect.
Thank you very much. So let me just state again that this project has received funding from the European Union Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program under the Marie Curie Grant Agreement number 1010-3646. I have a threefold structure for my talk today. I'm gonna start by briefly sketching out the pluralist turn, or what I take to be the pluralist turn in HBS. I will very quickly take a glimpse at other neglected pluralist traditions in the history of philosophy of science. Then I'll focus on what I call stylistic pluralism and on previous iterations of this idea of connecting styles and science with a pluralist aim in view. I will focus an essential part of my talk on Hacking's theory of styles of scientific reasoning, and I will then highlight some of the shortcomings of this notion, which I will try to integrate with Ha-Seok Chang's concept of systems of practice in the framework of his pluralist philosophy of science. And I will conclude by raising or dealing with an example, the example of what can be called a chemical style of thinking and doing. Concerning the pluralist turn, post-positivist philosophy of science can be perhaps described by as being characterized by three turns: the so-called historical turn, the practice turn, and the pluralist turn. Now, perhaps the pluralist turn is comprised of several turns. One can think of ontological, epistemological, methodological, experimental, axiological forms of pluralism. And sometimes these forms of pluralisms are in tension with one another. Here, I'm going to highlight two meta, or one meta tension, rather, the tension between which had already been highlighted by other people before me, of course, between a modest and radical approaches in pluralism. While modest approaches risk indirectly falling back into a kind of monism, to the extent that they tend to accommodate forms of monism, for instance, by seeing the plurality of languages, of ontologies, of methods of science as something temporary, for instance. So they tend to accommodate forms of monism to a certain extent. The latter, radical approaches, underscore, on the contrary, relativist and constructivist or rather risk to underscore, relativist and constructivist claims that ultimately undermine science and its claims to objectivity and progressiveness. With this respect, a paradoxical question might be asked whether and to what extent an excess of pluralism might even lead back to the strictures of closure and exclusion characterizing a monist approach. This has been highlighted, for instance, with respect to open science and the idea of epistemic diversity. So I'll go very quickly through previous pluralist projects in the history of philosophy of science, pluralist versions of the pluralist turn that, in my view, have been neglected. Especially in Anglophone discussions about pluralism. And of course, if one take a look outside the Anglophone or Germanophone traditions in philosophy and philosophy of science, there are other pluralist trends. And famously, some of them can be traced back to Auguste Comte, founder of positivism, and his idea that there are some specificities, for example, characterizing chemical phenomena that make them irreducible to physical phenomena. So the body of knowledge which pertain to chemical phenomena will never be reduced to physics, to put it in a nutshell. Again, continuing in this line of French versions of pluralism, one can refer to Gaston Bachelard's idea of there being multiple epistemological regions. This is the word that Bachelard uses. And it is a very interesting idea, an idea that Bachelard, for instance, applied to the analysis of what he called electric and mechanic forms of rationalisms or regions of science. Bachelard thinks that these two different regions, electric and mechanic forms of rationality, can and should collaborate in investigating the same portions of reality. In this respect, Bachelard's pluralism sounds a lot like Sandy Mitchell's integrity of pluralism, for instance. So part of what I'm trying to do is to also take an historical approach to the question of pluralism, and to, in a comparative perspective, to put in relation different strands, pluralist strands, and trying to gain possible insights that might advance and contribute to the discussion. And one neglected author in this framework is Gilles Gaston Granger, also a student of Jean Carriès and Gaston Bachelard, among others. So in the same epistemological tradition, so to speak. He wrote a very interesting analysis of style in relation to the sciences. This analysis came out in '68, and he used the notion of style to, these are his own words, to discern the plurality of the modes of expression and of construction of a concept, and to show how this plurality is linked to the different ways of practicing or living a symbolism. And in this respect, he also echoes, or rather, some more contemporary forms of pluralism. For instance, the one put forward by Philip Kitcher which I tend to see as a more radical form of integrative pluralism, in which different theories must at some point be translatable into one another. So two theories can be seen as two versions of one background theory, so to speak. So this idea that there are theoretical styles and the different versions that can be given of a single theory can be linked to Kitcher's epistemological pluralism. And another idea on which I will try to build what I'm going to say in the next part of my talk belongs to Michel Foucault. And it can be found in his archaeological works from the 60s, and it is spelled out in the Archaeology of Knowledge from 1969. And it is the idea that within what he calls discursive practice, which sometimes can correspond to a scientific discipline, but it is a much broader idea. In a discursive practice, there can be what he calls points of heresy. That is, points at which two competing theories diverge in some respects, despite coexisting within the same episteme. Now, we're not going to spell out what an episteme is. It is a rather complicated notion, of course, but it is the idea that there are, behind two opposing theories, there are sometimes shared assumptions and underlying frameworks that can be spelled out. And this is what Foucault calls an episteme sometimes. So this idea, I think, can be linked to what I call stylistic pluralism, and in particular, in my understanding of Hacking's stylistic projects. And we are going to go back to this project of Hacking in a second. I just wanted to conclude this first part about the pluralist turn by saying that the way I locate myself and my current project is in the attempt to situate, to define, first of all, and to situate something that can be called stylistic pluralism, and which can be very simply understood as the promotion of pluralism through the notion of scientific styles with respect to the pluralist turn, and with one question in mind, the question being whether stylistic pluralism is something that is a form of pluralism that allow us to recognize the advances, what can be considered as advances associated with the pluralist turn, without falling into the relativism and constructivism it is often taken to imply. In other words, whether stylistic pluralism it is able to find a middle way, a third way, striking a balance between modest and radical approaches to pluralism. Last word in general about my project. There's also the idea that it is interesting and that something can be learned from mapping the previous iterations of this idea of connecting style with science. And if one wants to dig that history, one can, for instance, see that style has been connected to knowledge at least since the early modern period, where a distinctive link between style and ways of thinking was formed, and such link played a specific role in the emergence, for instance, of philology as a model for knowledge, but also in discussions of scientific method. particularly by Renaissance Aristotelians. But more specifically, style, the notion of style is connected to scientific knowledge, in particular, in the 20th century. And this happens in at two very specific moments. One is the first decades of the 20th century, in a rather Germanophone or German-speaking milieu, where very different economists, sociologists, physicians, and philosophers, so different kinds of intellectuals, use the notion of style in relation to science and scientific knowledge. They gave different understanding of the ideas, but they share the notion that style was an encompassing and rather self-enclosed unit of analysis. One of the most remarkable theories of styles in connection to the sciences from this period is, of course, the one by Ludwig Fleck. Then there's a second phase or moment in which the notion of style is connected to the sciences, and it is an Anglophone, rather or prevalently Anglophone milieu or domain, where style is generally taken to scientific styles. The idea of there being scientific, a plurality of scientific styles, is taken to emphasize the plurality of standards of scientific inquiry, the idea that styles are historical and maybe also geographical. So they are contextual, so to speak. That styles suggests, so to speak, the idea that there's not just a simple reflective relation between a method of inquiry and the object of inquiry, but there's a sort of a shaping of the objects of inquiry by the style of inquiry, and some others have been led through the notion of style to rethink the divide between the arts and the sciences, for instance, by considering aesthetic criteria for theory choice, for instance, and things like that. So Ian Akin develops a theory of styles of scientific reasoning within this second phase, within the Anglophone phase, and his own take on style has been rather influential, as we will see in a second. I wanted to highlight that Hacking's project on style spans over 30 years, roughly. It starts with a sort of manifesto in 1982, and with each subsequent publication or essay or paper, he does something slightly different with the idea, and he applies it to different case studies. For instance, in the 90s, he first publishes a paper on the idea of there being identification criteria, criteria that we will see in a second. So criteria that enable one to identify styles in science, and then he applies the idea and this analytical tool to statistics, for example, or to what he calls the statistical style of reasoning, and to the laboratory style of reasoning. In what is now or up to date, the last publication on the subject, hacking, talks about the possible cognitive rooting of the idea of style. So the idea that maybe these ways of reasoning or ways of finding out, as he also calls them, are possibly based on cognitive modular abilities of our minds, and this is a last development or installment of the idea. So, as mentioned, this idea has been relatively influential. I listed some examples of concrete historical cases which were done using the notion of styles of reasoning as developed by hacking, and they are very different. They span from Davidson on the history of what he calls the psychiatric style of reasoning, to Gavroglu, writing on the history of high temperature physics, Schweber also on statistics as hacking himself, and then Elwick on biology, and so on and so forth. Of course, hacking wants his idea of style to be philosophical and even metaphysical to some extent. So the very notion of styles of reasoning has developed by hacking also attracted theoretical criticism. And the one edited by Ricci in 2012 is a special issue entirely dedicated to the notion of styles of reasoning. And then below, some shameless self-promotion of some of the work by hacking that I have been translating. For instance, this book on scientific reason, which is a series of lectures that hacking gave in Taiwan, 2008. Good part of the lectures are on styles of reasoning, on mathematics, and on what he calls the laboratory style of reasoning. And that's the cover of the Italian version of the book. And then there's this special issue on 2020, came out in 2021. Different scholars discussing hacking's philosophy and among other things, also the idea of styles of reasoning, and a collection of hacking's paper, including papers on styles of reasoning, coming out in French soon, hopefully. And there's also a special issue of the monist in preparation, also dedicated to hacking's philosophy, and also and I would say particularly to the notion of styles of reasoning. So hacking draws the idea from historian of science Alistair Crombie, who provides him with a template, a list of 6 styles of reasoning that he, both Crombie and also Hacking himself, take to be characterizing Western science. They go from mathematical postulation to historical genetical explanation, through other styles like the experimental explanation and measurement, and the hypothetical modeling styles of reasoning, which are the 2 that we are going to focus on, because they are thought by hacking as possibly leading to a farther 7th style that he calls the laboratory style of reasoning. There's a question mark there because in some early publications or some publications from the 90s, Hacking seems to be willing to introduce laboratory style of reasoning as a seventh style, so as an additional style created by the merging of the second and the third style of reasoning. But then he, in the last paper on the subject, he partially withdrew this idea, and in part because he wants to root and to ground his styles on modular and cognitive abilities. So even the function of this template changes, and from being an open template that can be modified and changed upon further investigation, something that should be used as a starting point, even for historical inquiry. Hacking seems to be willing to close this list to 6 and even possibly reduce it, because he's looking at the possible cognitive foundation for styles of reasoning, something that seems to be easier to do for some styles of reasoning, for instance, for the taxonomical style of reasoning, but something that it is less evident in the case of, for instance, the historical genetical forms of explanation. So as mentioned before, Hacking wants to give us identification criteria, which is another idea that he eventually gave up, but I think that it is very that it is key to understand his project. So I will lay emphasis on this idea that there are at least 2 important criteria for identifying something, a way of thinking and doing in science as instantiating a style of reasoning. A style of reasoning, or an SSR, introduces new kinds of items, namely new kinds of theoretical objects, objects that are introduced into scientific discourse by a given style of reasoning, new kinds of propositions that were unthinkable before the introduction of a given style of reasoning, propositions that with the introduction of an SSR become, so to speak, up for grabs for being either true or false. A style is also taken to introduce new kinds of laws, new kinds of evidence, and also new forms of explanations. The other important criterion that he emphasizes is the introduction of self-stabilization techniques. Now, the notion of self-stabilization techniques is not very clearly defined, in part because Hacking claims that these are the techniques that each SSR puts into place in order to maintain its functioning, so to keep itself alive, so to speak, and not be discarded. And they can go, for example, from the use of statistics to corroborate statistics itself, or in a laboratory style of reasoning, the production of new phenomena, the creation of phenomena in the laboratory can be taken as a self-stabilization techniques, and we'll see more techniques of concerning the laboratory style in a second. But so it is difficult to define what self-stabilization techniques are in general, because each SSR tends to have its own techniques in order to stabilize itself and to continue existing and proliferating, so to speak. Among the several items that a style of reasoning is meant to introduce, two are the items that are emphasized by and stressed by Hacking himself, and they are objects. So the introduction of theoretical entities, unobservable entities, for instance, in the case of the laboratory style of reasoning. And this is the reason why, for instance, ontological debates are connected to the introduction of a style of reasoning. So debates about the existence or the reality or the construction about certain entities, for instance, about the existence of taxa in biology. And the other item, which is very important and repeated over and over by Hacking, is propositions. So the idea that the emergence of an SSR makes some statement possible, statements that were unintelligible and unspeakable, so to speak, before the emergence of a way of reasoning about a given statement. So to sum up Hacking's idea, Hacking wants style to be historical, so to emerge historically. But while they are contextual and they come from and they emerge out of very contingent events, they become standards of objectivity that we come to think as eternal or universal. Some of them resist, some of them become, so to speak, atemporal canons of inquiry, but some others get discarded and sidelined and they die out. One of the examples that Hacking makes of a dying or abandoned style of reasoning is Paracelsian medicine, a style which Hacking claims had not enough self-stabilizing techniques in order to maintain its existence, so to speak, and therefore was discarded and abandoned. This is a very sketchy explanation that he only mentions in passing. But otherwise, apart from a couple of abandoned styles, his theory of style is rather presentist, so to speak. He focuses on styles that are still with us, that emerged historically, but they are still part of our scientific toolbox, so to speak. An important idea is that SSR are not mutually exclusive. They are collaborative. And generally they are cumulative. So once we learned how to reason statistically, we don't forget it, and a scientist must be at home with many styles of reasoning at once, not just one. So styles do not overlap with scientific disciplines. The notion of styles of reasoning cut across disciplinary boundaries in this sense that they are really tools to be used in the different sciences by researchers. So the idea is that they are not, and they cannot, for this reason, be incommensurable. So this is if generally the idea of styles can have some similarities with Kuhn's paradigms, for instance. This is where Hacking wants to take part to distantiate himself from Kuhn, for instance. In thinking styles are not incommensurable. Also because they, as mentioned before, they can merge into one another. For instance, the laboratory style of reasoning can be seen as the merging of the hypothetical modeling and the experimental and measuring ways of reasoning. Hacking also wants to defend his theory from relativism. He wants his styles to explain how objectivity became possible. This is his phrase. He aims to take up this Kantian project of explaining objectivity. So he doesn't want styles to imply relativism, and he wants to distinguish relativity, which is the idea that every proposition which requires some reasoning in order to be established, so every proposition which is not a mere observation statement receives the possibility of being intelligible, or the possibility of having a truth value, thanks to the style of reasoning of which it is part. This is what Hacking calls relativity. So the idea that truth values are relative to a style of reasoning, but not relativism, because he still wants to stick to the idea that what makes a specific proposition either not specifically true or specifically false, it is not a style of reasoning to decide that, but it is how the word is done. So he wants to keep style accountable to how the word actually is. Of course, now I was just trying to illustrate briefly this theory, which, as mentioned, it spans over multiple publications and over several years. But people have identified several blind spots and several flaws. For instance, his defense against relativism was not considered as very convincing. Other people, has Joseph Rawls most famously criticized Hacking precisely for not being able to develop an idea of style which is accountable to the word, so which is objective in this sense, because it focuses too much on intra-linguistic coherence among propositions and statements. But it is not on these criticisms that I will focus. I will rather focus on these two different points. The fact that it is not entirely clear to me whether Hacking styles of reasoning instantiate a form of pluralism. And if so, what form of pluralisms do they instantiate? And one of the main problems with Hacking styles is that they do not account for practices in a sufficient way. So practices are insufficiently taken into account. So his notion of styles of reasoning is not sufficiently practice oriented, and this is paradoxical for someone like Hacking, who contributed much to the practice turn in history and philosophy of science. His representing and intervening from 1983 is regarded as one of the works claiming attention or attracting attention, drawing the attentions of philosophers of science to experiments. So paradoxically, when it comes to ways of finding out and of reasoning in the sciences, when it comes to this very general take on of what science is and how science develops through times, Hacking's style seems to be not very effective in taking account the experimental aspects of science. Very quickly on the question of whether styles instantiate a form of pluralism. Of course, I asked myself this question because I thought for quite some time that it was, of course, the idea of styles come with the idea that there must be a plurality of ways of reasoning. So if there's the idea of there being more than one method or ways of doing things in science, then there's some plurality involved. So that's pluralism. But I found myself thinking whether this was not a form of what people, and in particular Stéphanie Ruffi, have called a patchwork pluralism. So the idea that science is very diverse, and there's a plurality of ways of representing and constructing ontologies and so on and so forth that characterize the science. This is a kind of pluralism, but actually I'm still struggling with the idea of whether this is a pluralist approach or not. But for sure, it is a position which emphasizes plurality and the diversity of science, but perhaps it ranks among the more modest approach to pluralism. Nevertheless, there's in Hacking the idea that, and I quote his own words, our overall interest in truth and reason may well be served by letting other styles of reason evolve in their own ways, unfettered by a more imperial kind of rationalism. So at least there's this idea that we should let styles proliferate and not try to reduce them to one another. The diversity of the ways of thinking in science is irreducible, so to speak. So at least that's a hint of or a suggestion toward strong commitment or a strong description of plurality there. But what about pluralism or more stronger forms of pluralism? People have recognized or taken inspiration in Hacking's theory for ontological forms of pluralism. For instance, Ruffi, that I just mentioned, she developed her idea of a foliated pluralism. So the idea of a new style of reasoning enriching ontologically pre-existing objects and she applies this idea to astronomy, for instance, or people have referred to hacking styles and developed from there sort of methodological pluralism, like Ottavio Bueno, who talks about a plurality of inferential strategies characterizing the different sciences. But so clearly, pluralism at stake in hacking, but I still wonder whether these are instances of what Rufi herself calls patchwork pluralism. So an acknowledgement of plurality without an active commitment towards the enhancement and the development of this plurality itself. We'll return to this in the conclusion. So what I'm getting at is the idea or the question whether there is a sort of epistemological pluralism in hacking, which I find suggested in some passages where he takes up Foucault's idea quoted at the beginning of my talk. It is an idea that hacking calls Foucault's fork. So he dubs this idea using the reference to Foucault, and it is the idea that two parties agreeing to the same styles of reasoning may well totally disagree on the upshot, one party holding for true what the other party rejects. And here, okay, so I'll leave aside the experimental pluralism of the two quotes below. I'll try to stick to epistemological pluralism. Okay, this is so far was my question about what kind of pluralism does hacking instantiate, and here it is my second worry about the account of practice. In one of the papers that I mentioned before on the laboratory style of reasoning and how laboratory sciences tend to stabilize themselves, hacking lists 15 elements, 15 aspects or factors that contribute to the stability of laboratory sciences. And they can be grouped into three macro categories of ideas, things, and marks. The interaction about these three levels is what enables a laboratory science to be progressive, so to speak, and cumulative, and to advance somehow. But curiously enough, hacking doesn't take this list to be a clarification of a laboratory style of reasoning. Among these factors, he doesn't list the laboratory style of reasoning itself, and he even says, and I'm now quoting the passage from the box here below, I have omitted from my list something that is rather rigid during the time span of even the most extended experiment styles of scientific reasoning. So even if in later publications, hacking wants to abandon the term styles of reasoning, and he favors the expression ways of thinking and doing, precisely because he would like to take into account this idea of things to be done, practices to be carried out thanks to a specific style of reasoning. His notion of styles is perhaps too broad in scope and to be relevant for understanding the details of scientific practices. So this is where I draws several insights from Azok Chang to further develop, so to speak, the Hacking's idea of styles and to save it, so to speak, to some extent. So the idea of a system of practice is the idea that Chang defines as a system formed by a coherent set of epistemic activities performed with a view to achieve certain aims. And similarly, as with the coherence of each activity, it is the overall aims of a system of practice that define what it means for the system to be coherent. And this idea of coherence, which is at the root of the idea of a system of practice, goes beyond the mere consistency between the propositions involved in the activities. But coherence involves, in other terms, the effectiveness or the extent to which a set of practices is effective in achieving a given aim. As it is well known, Chang develops this philosophical background in order to better account for practices in science, and he applies this to several case studies, most notably to his rereading of the history of the chemical revolution. But he himself enriches his idea of systems of practice by reference to Pickstone's notion of ways of knowing, which gets very similar probably to what Hacking means by styles of reasoning. So ways of knowing are, according to Chang understanding of the notion, types of systems of practice. So they are meta systems of practice. A system type is a class consisting of various systems, all of which share some core activities. And a system type is not an actual system, not even a very general one, but an incomplete characterization of a system with blanks consciously left to be filled in. And of course, depending on the way one fills the blanks, we have very different instantiations of the type. Chang draws on this idea when he wants to distinguish what he calls, or can be called, principalism as a way of thinking that can be, to some extent, opposed to compositionism in the history of chemistry. So principalism is the idea that principles are fundamental substances that import certain characteristic properties to other, certain characteristic properties to other substances. So there's this idea that there's a ontological hierarchy among substances, and some substances are more important than others. They are called principles, and they transform, so to speak, other substances. For instance, phlogiston is the principle which imparts both inflammability and metallicity to substances, according to Stahl. What are the epistemic activities that are carried out in this meta system of practice, which is principalism? Well, one classifies substances according to observable properties, one explains the properties of substances by reference to principles, and one tries to transform substances by applying or withdrawing, so subtracting these principles. So this is a way of knowing which is larger than than phlogiston theory, but phlogiston theory, so to speak, can be lodged inside or within this way of knowing, which is to a very large extent opposed to compositionism, which is tied to the idea that substances are like building blocks that maintain their properties through reactions. And chemical substances in particular are either elements or compounds made up of those elements. The activities that are at the core of compositionisms are either decomposition or recomposition. And in this framework, arithmetical weight considerations become very important in a way which is simply not at all important in principalism. All this, and I'm going to conclude very briefly. I know my time is almost up. All this, it's interesting because it is as it is very well known, framed in a pluralist understanding of science. Hazok Chang wants to offer pluralism as an ideal of science, and I quote him saying that I will define pluralism in science as the doctrine advocating the cultivation of multiple systems of practice in any given field of science. So it is a stronger sense of pluralism, precisely to the extent that it is not empirical, or it does not limit itself to the description or the acknowledgement of the plurality of methods and of languages and ontologies, but it is the embracement and the active commitment in the production, in the fostering, or in keeping different paths of inquiry open. So that's this idea that plurality, even at the theoretical level, enriches knowledge. Different theories about the same portions of reality might get at some truth, both of them, even if they are very different, and even if they are opposed to some extent to one another, they can get some, they can tell us something important about the same portion of reality. They are like different windows on the same panorama. Chang's pluralism, it's most notably defined by its interactive feature. Different systems of practice should be considered in their interaction and in the way in which through their interaction they can advance knowledge and science. Interaction can happen in 3 different ways, through integration, co-optation, and competition. We don't have time to go into these details right now. We can come back on that later. I'll cut this long story in a short way by saying that we can take insights from both Hacking's idea of styles of reasoning and Chang's idea of systems of practice, and come up with the idea of a chemical style of thinking and doing, which is something that had been already at least partially suggested, although not with the same aim in view, by Bernadette Vincent, who described the chemical style of thinking as characterized by a specific way of knowing through making, with a concern with individual materials rather than matter in general, and a specific commitment to nature. Now, this way of understanding what chemistry is about is a way that builds on Hacking's understanding of styles of reasoning, but in a way which is not exclusive of neither principalism nor compositionism, in a way that this chemical style of thinking can embrace both phlogistonists and oxygenists as two divergent perspectives that are premised in a style of thinking which, despite being very different within itself, has some shared presuppositions and some common points. So, concluding, I wanted to try to highlight some of the shortcomings of Hacking and to try to work on these shortcomings. And by doing so, I was also thinking that if styles of reasoning, not only in Hacking himself, but in many of the authors who appeal to the idea of the history of science being basically a history of scientific styles, there is this idea of a big picture historiography. So big, long-running narratives. And clearly, this is a way of writing the history of science which goes in another direction with respect to hyper-contextualized micro-narratives. But maybe a balance can be struck between these two extremes. So maybe improving Hacking's theory through Chang's insights, we can find a balance between big picture history of science and more fine grade practice-based analysis. And specifically, what I think it can be gained through Chang's systems of practice is a better equipment to account for practices and experimentation, as already said, but also a more specific pluralist and interactivist approach by giving further substance to insights that were present in and so to speak, already at stake in Hacking's idea of styles of reasoning being not mutually exclusive, but being collaborative. Sorry for the very rushed conclusion. These are the references. I'm happy to share them even separately. And I thank you very much for your attention and for your patience.